Sri Aurobindo is leading us through a logical process to recognize that there is something greater than mind, of which mind is an inferior working. And it is this which the Kena Upanishad refers to as mind of our mind. In the portion we saw last time, he points out the three principal elements of our mentality: thought, will, and sensation, and how they try to seize on the deeper truth of things, draw out the deeper potentiality, and enjoy the thing. But these three tendencies are constantly limited because of the compromise that mind has with life and matter in the human body. But there is a power greater than these three, mind, life, and body, which they have to call into them in order for these tendencies to be freely fulfilled. And such a power, says the Veda, does exist. It is the truth consciousness which sees the truth directly, which is able to express effectively the potentiality of each thing, and which is able to seize and enjoy the essential delight-giving quality, the rasa of things. Now the paragraph we are now studying, we read it briefly. If then such a deeper principle of consciousness exists, it must be that, and not mind, which is the original and fundamental intention concealed in nature, and which eventually and somewhere must emerge. But is there any reason for supposing that it must emerge here and in mind, as mind has emerged in life and life in matter? Now this question may sound strange to us, because especially having gone through the whole discussion so far, it seems almost obvious that there has to be this greater power working through mind which must eventually emerge. But it is not so obvious for those who are trained in the thinking of the more traditional Vedantic perspectives, or who are trained in the thinking of certain religious doctrines, which do not see a linking point, a transition, a continuity of connection between the material world and the divine. Even in the conventional Vedantic teaching as it survives today, they consider mind to be the apex of consciousness in the divided world, and it is as if the peak of the mountain and the self is above like the sun. The sun's light can reflect from the peak of the mountain, but the peak and the sun can never touch. Such an assumption is so deeply rooted in these traditions. In most religions as they survive today, God is far away, God is distant. There you need an intermediary, either somebody who receives God's command or teaching in a revelation, or some priest who is able to sense as a medium between God and the human domain. And there is a necessity for some kind of an approximation, partiality, because of the huge gap which cannot be healed. Sri Aurobindo differs from all these traditions in this respect, and this is perhaps one of the biggest, most significant differences, that he insists, like the Veda, in a continuity of consciousness from the most material to the highest essential spirit. And there is a continuity in the descent from the highest spirit, involving itself, reducing itself in terms as if concealing itself to itself until it comes down all the way to the material. And in the involution there is a continuity, and therefore in the evolution there must be a continuity which completes in the ascent the ladder which was formed in the descent. When we actually study most of the ancient traditions, including the religions as they survive today, in their original sense, they have, at least in their mystical teaching, some such idea also, which subsequently has been clearly lost. In the Christian tradition, they refer to Jacob's ladder, which is a double ladder also. And Sri Aurobindo points to this as a symbol of this truth of involution and evolution, linking the material domain with the spirit in a continuity. So this question is important because it exists. It is a necessary resistance in the human mind. And so he answers the question. We answer in the affirmative because mind has in itself, however obscurely, that tendency, that aspiration, and at bottom, that necessity. The answer is very simple. Because in the mind there is this compulsion, therefore there must be this as the deeper principle, which is nature's intention to eventually reveal. And that intention in nature reflects in our mind as a constant urge to reach out towards precisely those tendencies which belong to that deeper principle of consciousness. He says, obscurely, and then, so however obscurely we may see, there is a tendency, there is an aspiration, and at bottom a necessity. These three words describe the degrees. First of all, we see a tendency. Our mind tries to know perfectly, and implied in that is the aspiration that such a thing is within my reach, should be within my reach, and if I make sufficient effort, I should be able to acquire all knowledge. And behind that aspiration is a necessity. And the necessity is such that if I cannot have that perfect knowledge, there is a frustration, there is a revolt, a reaction of against the insufficiency of the mind, and something within which tries harder, because it is as if something necessary to be achieved. So this is the evidence straight away, generally stated. Now Sri Aurobindo goes deeper, shows how across the whole evolutionary process, from matter to life, life to mind, and therefore mind to supermind, there is this tendency of something lower involved, already present, but which becomes explicit when it is able to organize itself to express freely. And so he describes this in the example of matter, life, and mind. We read it briefly last time, but I said we should explore further because each of the tendencies he points to is something which we can become aware of in ourselves, and when we are aware of it, we can amplify, we can make stronger, we can give it the necessary participation and support from our free will to develop and to perfect those tendencies, and thereby to make complete the process which nature slowly and laboriously pushes out in her evolution. So first he starts with matter. He says, there is one law from the lowest to the highest. Matter, when we examine it closely, proves to be instinct with the stuff of life. And then he describes, what is this? The vibrations, actions and reactions, attractions and repulsions, contractions and expansions, the tendencies of combination, formation and growth, the seekings and responses, which are the very substance of life. But the visible principle of life can only emerge when the necessary material conditions have been prepared which will permit it to organize itself in matter. So the life tendencies he has mapped out inside matter, but the visible form of living matter is when these tendencies are sufficiently organized that life can exist as if separate, freely expressing in matter. Now, if you observe these tendencies which he describes, they are slightly different from the conventional biology teaching, as most of us would have been through in our school. In biology, they describe living and non-living objects. So the concept of this separation is deliberately instilled in children at an early age. It is considered to be a great thing, but from a certain spiritual perspective, perhaps it is an error. One should rather instill this knowledge that life is involved in matter and struggles to emerge, and then show the processes of emergence and then how it organizes itself explicitly. That would be a better way of teaching, and subsequently for the other levels also. So in our biology, they say an object is living if it has food, it is feeding, if it has movement, respiration, excretion, growth, sensitivity or response, and reproduction. But if you consider what these things actually mean, when we say feeding, what's the principle behind that any living thing needs to enter in relation with the universe because it cannot exist in separation, and needs through that relationship to take in material which it requires, which it does not have, for its sustenance. That's all it means. The physical act of preparing food and putting it in our mouth is only a very specialized form of this need. There are creatures like the worm, for example, which can absorb nourishment directly through the skin of the body. The worm, as it crawls through the soil, is feeding continuously through the skin surface from its environment. It also has its mouth through which it absorbs. If you go down still lower at a bacterial level, there is no obvious form of mouth. The cell itself has holes all over, and the holes have specialized filters which are able to distinguish between what is safe and what is not, what it needs, how much, and take in only that much, open only for that, and close at a molecular level, which is extraordinary considering the intelligence involved in recognizing what is required and how much is required, and coordinating across the full surface of the cellular wall of the bacteria. So we already see here signs of intelligence, but that is a separate discussion after. So this is the feeding. Second is movement, and biology describes both external movement and internal, to be able to move things around within ourselves. Respiration is again a variation of feeding. It is exchanging at a gaseous level. Oxygen, as we are commonly used to, but there are equally bacteria which do not breathe oxygen. They live at the bottom of the ocean where there's no sunlight and no oxygen, and sometimes even they breathe in materials which are toxic to human oxygen breathing creatures. Excretion is only a variation of this, completing the cycle. If you take in something, you need to throw out something, and so on. Growth is an ability for life form to begin as if in a small corner, small bit, small size, and then develop itself, sustain itself in growth. And the next, which is most important, is sensitivity and responsiveness to environmental circumstances and changes. And reproduction is again a very specialized activity where the same life form is able to project itself into the environment and spawn a new one. At a bacterial level, it is so simple. The entire bacterium splits into two, and each part is complete in itself and can grow again. When we come to more specialized creatures, then they need more specialized devices for reproduction. But the principle, if you see, at a bacterial level, is not so complex. The thing itself as a unit is able to split into two complete units. That's all. Now, if you see Sri Aurobindo's list, it goes to something much more fundamental. It looks at not these formed processes, but the principles behind them. First, he points to vibration. The first expression of life in matter is this ability to modify itself and oscillate in its modification. It changes, but the changes themselves cannot continue indefinitely. They must come back and change again and come back. So the process of change is as if a repeating vibration. Next, action and reaction. So it is able to act on itself and its environment, respond to circumstances internal to itself and outside. So that's a reaction. Attractions and repulsions. So in relation to things, whatever supports the life, it is drawn to, it prefers that, it moves in that direction, it accepts, and that which is contrary, which is opposing the life expression, it avoids. Contractions and expansions. Now here is the interesting part. This principle of contraction and expansion is something which can operate on many levels. At a very physical level, the worm contracts to move away from something, expands to move towards something, and then contracts the tail to complete the movement, expands the front, expands the rest of the body, then contracts, and thus it is able to have a movement without legs. But the same thing may be happening internally, where to move food from one edge of the bacterium to the other edge, from the center to the edge or the edge to the center, the only way to move is this process of contracting one part to push and expanding to pull. And so contraction and expansion are much more fundamental to feeding, movement, respiration, excretion. And if that is not there, none of these refined and sophisticated and specialized forms could exist. And then the tendencies of combination, formation, and growth. So matter is able to take something, join with it. Let's say a bacterium is able to take something which is separate outside it, take it inside, and then combine with what is inside. Or if two things are inside, it is able to join and combine them when needed to produce heat or to make a new chemical which did not exist before in itself. So the combination of different elements to express new qualities which did not exist. This is what we would call in a more sophisticated living being digestion. You absorb and then you join to create something new. And so through combination, it forms something new. It then arranges those new things to create a new formation, and through continued arrangement, it grows. So it can rebuild a damaged part, it can expand the whole form of it to make it larger, and of course there are more complex tendencies of form. And then seekings and responses. So both of these, reaching out to what is needed and responding to environmental changes, both of these you will see are not only life processes but imply intelligence. You seek towards something because it is required. You respond in a way that is meaningful, intelligent, that there is an outcome that is useful. Now, all of these we can see in a bacterium and, of course, subsequently in more complex forms in higher life forms. But Sri Aurobindo is saying you see these in matter. If you look at a molecule, if you look at an atom, you will see all of these tendencies. There is, first of all, the vibration. In the atom, the whirling electron is only a vibration of energy, rhythmically vibrating and moving. And therefore we describe as if electron waves oscillating around the center of the atom. In the molecular structure, the vibrations become more complex. From one end of the molecule to the other, there are ripples of vibration moving. And those vibrations are used in the molecule's movement to join parts, extremes of the molecule to form more complex structures. The action and reaction in the atom, for example, if there is another atom nearby, there is an action experienced or a reaction experienced, either attraction or repulsion. And this is the next, attractions and repulsions. It's even there in a single proton or electron. In a molecule, it becomes far more complex. Contractions and expansions. So when atoms are squeezed together, they undergo a kind of a pressure. But in what way they respond to that pressure is interesting. When you squeeze it, internally there is a pressure built up inside the electron which pushes back outward to maintain its form. There is actually a resistance that the atom offers to any external pressure which might break it. That resistance is so great that atoms cannot be broken except under very intense, very high energies. So when an atom bomb has to be exploded, you have to create a very high pressure wave, and the way it is done, you create a high pressure wave which is spherical, and the pressure wave piles up towards the center, and as it approaches the center, the pressure builds up geometrically until it reaches a peak which is impossible to attain by any mechanical process, which is impossible to sustain more than a few microseconds. And as that pressure wave hits, there is a compression, two atoms are forced to join, release of energy, and then the chain reaction follows, which keeps a self-sustaining pressure breaking up a few other atoms. At the end of the whole process, very few atoms are actually broken. And that's the kind of resistance which you see inside the atom, but that resistance itself is able to oppose pressure by a movement of contraction and expansion. In a molecule, the same contraction and expansion is more complex. The molecule varies, of course, with heat, but it also varies in its relation with other molecules around. The molecules are constantly vibrating, and in the movement between themselves, you see the molecules as if in part attracted somewhere as they expand, and then they contract, and there is effectively a movement of molecules like the worm moving. In water, if you put a grain of salt, after a while it dissolves, and the entire water becomes salty. It is evenly spread out. How does that happen? If you think about the process at a molecular level, on the surface of this crystal, some molecules detach as they enter in relation with the water. But then they have to travel all the way across the water, all the way to the surface. And they spread out evenly. At the end of a few days, the entire water content is evenly salty, which means a molecule at one end is as if in relation with molecules at the other end. And if somewhere there is a greater concentration, there is a pushing out from there towards the lesser concentration areas. But all of this is happening so slowly and such a microscopic level, we do not recognize that it is in fact a movement of expansion or contraction. Then the tendencies of combination, formation and growth. When you put in a supersaturated solution of salt, one grain of salt which is tied, it acts like a seed. It begins to accumulate around itself all the salt molecules and grows to become a crystal, perfectly formed, perfectly symmetrical. Or in the rock you will see, in no rock is there a pure element. All elements are combining constantly to form more and more complex elements. And this tendency to combine is so automatic, except in a rock it may take a few million years. Within the human body, it takes place within a few minutes in the digestive process. But if you think about it, the process is exactly the same. If two objects touch, and if they are different elements, at the point of contact the elements join and make more complex combinations, which influence the next pure element to create more complex combinations, and so on. Eventually there is a diffusion which takes place. When we observe a mine under the earth for specialized metals, you see they call it a gold vein. There is a particular rock which is supposed to be indicative that there is gold. If that rock is not there, then you will not find gold. And gold is inside that, in a thin vein. If you think about how the gold is formed, somehow there's a process taking place by which even gold seems to emerge out of the rock and take a special form. And this was believed until about 100 years ago, when finally this was thrown out of physics and they said gold somehow at some point just fell there in a straight single line. It doesn't make sense. There is a capacity in matter to regenerate and to form new substances. And now they're saying there are actually bacteria which are involved in creation of gold. And perhaps in nature those bacteria also play a role. We do not know. But this is all in the domain of speculation, because science does not want to accept that there is life force in matter. But if you go back 100 years, they recognized this line, this vein of gold, they called it. A vein seems to be formed, and there is a whole machinery of molecules around it which is feeding to form the gold vein. And the same process in the formation of crystals is most obviously seen. A crystal takes material from all around it to form complex structures and to grow. And then finally the seekings and responses. To any material object, if you push in a particular way, there is a response. But by itself also, it reaches out towards things that are helpful to it. This is seen in more complex processes of crystals. For example, when a crystal grows, if there is nearby another crystal, the growth of the first crystal will tend to curve towards the other crystal. Now we may explain it in terms of electric fields which influence each other, but the fact is there is a response to the environment, and the growth of the crystal is in response to it. And there is actually a seeking, turning the form of the crystal. So all of these tendencies are there. Sri Aurobindo refers in the Life Divine to Jagadish Chandra Bose, who explored this domain of life force in matter. He did some remarkable experiments, considering that it was with a technology now more than 100 years ago, when they did not have any of the sophisticated electronics. There was no electronics at all during that period. All experiments had to do with mechanical devices only. And he measured the growth of a plant and the growth of a crystal and created a device to project the growth on the wall, which is quite remarkable considering the fine sensitivities involved. And it was found both grow in exactly the same pattern. A bamboo shoot has a rapid growth, a pause, rapid growth, pause, rapid growth, pause. During the pause, there's as if a slight bounce back, expansion, contraction. The same with the crystal, rapid growth, pause, and a slight bouncing back. And when the two graphs are placed next to each other, you cannot distinguish. He explored metal fatigue. You bend metal repeatedly until it breaks. But before it breaks, if you stop, the molecules rejoin and heal themselves, just as muscular tissue in any living organism. And he showed graphs of both, the breakdown as well as the healing process, and it's called a hysteresis loop. The two match exactly. You cannot distinguish one from the other. And then the question comes, if it is the same exact pattern taking place, the force with which manages both is exactly the same. Life energy in organized living substance and in non-organized so-called dead matter is exactly the same in its processes. Next, but then he says, but the visible principle of life, where we can say, this is living, can only emerge when the necessary material conditions have been prepared, which will permit it to organize itself in matter. And these material conditions are what we see in a sophisticated form, which biology describes to indicate a living object: feeding, movement, respiration, excretion, growth, response, and reproduction. But these are only sophisticated organizational structures by which the life form now can express life freely. Consider a worm which does not have complex vocal organs. Can it speak? It does not have complex ear structures. Can it hear? The answer actually is yes. But the way it speaks is so basic. It can make sounds by its body movements, or perhaps even in the movement of its mouth, but they would be very basic, simple sounds. It can hear because the whole body vibrates when there is a sound, and it can hear with the whole body. It doesn't have a separate ear drum, which is highly sensitive to a wider range of frequencies. But the principle of all the senses are already there, even though the worm seems to be blind because it has no organized eye structure. Its skin responds to light, the entire skin surface. So it can see, it can hear, it can speak, it can taste, smell. All 5 senses are there. But because those senses are not organized in an obvious and sophisticated way, we say the worm is blind, deaf, and so on. But the reality is it has all 5 senses. When the ear becomes a complex, sophisticated device, when the mouth creates a sophistication of sounds, then we say, that is speech and hearing. So in the same way, any emergence of life, when it is able to organize itself, then we see explicitly and say, yes, that is living. And this is the principle he will describe all the way through to Supermind. So also, life is instinct with the stuff of mind, abounds with, and he now describes the characteristics of mind inside life, abounds with an unconscious sensation, will, intelligence. But the visible principle of mind can only emerge when the necessary vital conditions have been prepared, which will permit it to organize itself in living matter. So there's a footnote, because Sri Aurobindo uses the word unconscious sensation, will, and intelligence. He says, I use the language of the materialist Haeckel in spite of its paradoxical form. This word unconscious is used in the materialist vocabulary to indicate that these are mechanical, as if automatic processes. They do not represent consciousness or real awareness of any kind, or even mind. And yet, when we say sensation, will, and intelligence, you cannot speak of unconscious, because intelligence and will and sensation involve awareness of some kind. So it's a paradoxical use, but we use the word in this sense that they are still not self-aware. They are of an awareness which is so low, so undeveloped as to be almost seeming to be unconscious. So, three things he describes: sensation, will, intelligence. Observe the bacterium. In response to external circumstances, it knows, and sensation is nothing but a awareness of receiving information of things around which are not part of its form. Will is attempting to exert itself on those circumstances, and intelligence is exerting for a specific outcome. It's a very interesting movie which I would recommend you to see. It is called Ex Machina. It was released last year. It's about artificial intelligence and a machine which is now behaving intelligently, and there is an attempt to test whether it is genuinely intelligent. Can it actually fool a human being and convince you that it is intelligent? And at the end of the movie we find, without revealing the story, that the machine is capable of scheming, of manipulating another person to fulfill what it wants to do. And that scheming and manipulation represents a very high level of sophistication, precisely of these things, will and intelligence. I want to exert on my circumstances for a particular outcome, and the intelligence is so sophisticated that it can plan out a complex chain of dependencies and navigate through them for that specific outcome. But the thing itself exists at a very rudimentary level in the bacterium, where it senses, it asserts its influence on the environment. Even in digestion, it involves a will, a will and an intelligence, as I pointed out. You could go all the way to the atomic level. And there are philosophers who have spoken of the will in the atom. The will in the atom to exist, to refuse to be broken, to assert itself on its environment. But that will can assert only if there is a sensation. And the sensation in the atom is the response that it gives to external atoms. The presence of another atom modifies this atom. We will say it is through electric fields, electromagnetic fields, and through radiation, whatever name we give to. Those are precisely the means through which our five senses operate. So the atom also has a sensory response to environment, and therefore sensation, a will compelling it to stay, to retain itself, and even to assert itself on those circumstances, and then the intelligence. More obvious in the bacteria's digestion process, selection process of what food to take in, or in its process of growth, and I'll come to a good example shortly. But in the atom, the intelligence is not so obvious. And yet, if you observe carefully, it is precisely that intelligence which we recognize in our study of the atom, and we declare it as a law of physics. When we map that intelligent behavior, we make a formula which is mathematically perfect. If there was no real intelligence, no evenness of response which has a meaningful outcome, the atom's responses, if at all there were any, would be chaotic. And a large bunch of atoms, each giving chaotic responses, would not lead to a cosmos, an ordered, structured expression of matter. Because there is a consistency in all the atoms' responses, in all the particles' responses and molecules' responses, successively more complex from particle to atom to molecule, but still consistent. Therefore, we can have a structured and ordered appearance of the physical universe. Those so-called laws of physics, perfectly described in a mathematical formula, are precisely the intelligent response. Non-chaotic, meaningful, and the meaningfulness of all these atoms combine to create even more complex, more meaningful structures. But in the bacterium, how do we see intelligence? There's a very interesting experiment, the news item of which I saw in 1992, I believe, in which in a petri dish of bacteria, they introduced a poison which would kill it. Of course, of the millions of bacteria, most of them died. A few survived. And all those which survived, when they were isolated, it was discovered they had all of them gone through exactly the same mutation to make them resistant to this particular poison. And the conclusion the researchers came to was there is an inherent intelligence inside the bacterium which knows exactly how to modify its genetic structure to make it immune to a specific poison. Now that intelligence is obviously so sophisticated because modern scientists trying to understand the genetic structure still cannot make exact correlations between external form and the genetic structure, between behavior and genetic structure. We see connections, we see these parts of the genes are involved in those processes, but how exactly we do not know. But internally within the bacterium is this sophisticated intelligence that in response to an exact poison knows exactly what genetic molecules to move around to make it resilient to that poison in a single generation. And that is intelligence of a hugely sophisticated kind, more sophisticated than our computers, which are not able to decode this relation exactly. But to say this would be anathema to scientists because of the presumption that there cannot be intelligence, or at least sophisticated intelligence, in rudimentary forms of life or so-called dead matter. But if we recognize that behind life involved was this intelligence, and from its involved position it is constantly pushing upon life and even guiding it secretly as through a veil, and that intelligence of mind is itself containing within it secretly supermind which has complete knowledge, then that complete knowledge through two veils can act upon the material biological processes to give them just the nudge necessary to make just the right correction to be able to survive and to grow. So, he continues, but the visible principle of mind can only emerge when the necessary vital conditions have been prepared, which will permit it to organize itself in living matter. And those are the vital conditions where the organization of the life processes have become sophisticated enough. Now, in the human being, in the human cell, not even in the biology, just at a cellular level, the processes of life are so sophisticated. The bulk of our challenge in pharmaceutical exploration, in biochemical exploration, in now they call it bioinformatics, bringing computers into the biology exploration. The bulk of the challenge is making sense of something so complex. And the first step towards that is mapping it out. Now, in a single cell, we observe processes which are so complex that if we had to write them in minute letters and map them as links of its process of chemical reactions and combinations, then a page of paper 2 meters by 2 meters square would be filled with intricate graphs of lines and intermediate structures of molecules that have to combine, modify, interact with each other to eventually produce a specific outcome, all taking place in one tiny corner of the cell. Such a massive complex graph cannot but be held together, guided by some intelligence which is equally encompassing and equally complex. Just because that intelligence operates instinctively, subconsciously, not able to express its self-awareness directly because at a molecular level it cannot. We cannot say that there is no intelligence just because of that. That same intelligence eventually forms complex neural networks which combine to create a sophisticated pattern of expression, and that forms the brain. But the complexity there is not very different from what's happening inside the cell. It has just moved to a different level of expression. But still, after that, if there was not a mouth or eyes or ears to feed the brain, to allow a response, we would still not know there is intelligence inside. The whale's brain is larger than the human brain, about this size, maybe up to 10 times the mass, even a large, in terms of pure numbers of the cells, much larger, 3 or 4 times at least. Perhaps the whale is far more intelligent than the human, perhaps. Which is the reason why dolphins and whales don't attack human beings. They are naturally friendly creatures, because being of a more developed consciousness, they do not need to fight. They see beyond petty responses of anger and hatred, perhaps. In fact, in a very interesting experiment in a dolphin, it was observed that you could trigger the anger center of the dolphin electrically, and the first time that the dolphin was triggered to get angry, the dolphin showed a response of anger. Then it showed a response of surprise. It was surprised that it got angry because it didn't intend to. And then immediately the brain processes modified themselves, and subsequent attempts to stimulate anger failed. You could trigger the brain, but the dolphin refused to get angry. So that first moment of surprise made it aware that it was pushed into something it did not want, and thereafter it could will itself to refuse subsequent stimuli. Now that's a level of sophistication we don't find in common human beings yet. In more developed people who have gone through a whole discipline of refining themselves, of a sadhana of a kind at least, a purification of emotions, then you have this similar result. But the dolphin had it without doing any sadhana. So are we to say that they are more sophisticated, more evolved? Perhaps. But because they do not have vocal cords like us, because they cannot articulate language the way we do, we say they are not intelligent enough, or they are not intelligent at all. But in their behavior, they do express remarkably sophisticated intelligence. So I'm deliberately showing these borderlines of life and mind to show how complex things actually are. And Sri Aurobindo points precisely to these essential tendencies to show that mind emerges finally only when the necessary conditions allow it to organize itself in the living matter. Otherwise it is there, only it cannot explicitly express itself. And so now we come to the most important part of this discussion. Mind too is instinct with the stuff of supermind. And this is such an important statement. It means the possibility of evolution into a supramental consciousness is not something far away, is not a distant dream or hope or imagination. It is a reality in the way our mind is formed right now. The potentiality is already there, embedded inside the existing working of our mind. And Sri Aurobindo lists, I think broadly 7 tendencies, which are precisely indicative of the emergence or the principle, the working of the principle of supermind. And after listing those, we see mind too is instinct with the stuff of supermind. Sympathies, unities, intuitions, emergences of pre-existing knowledge, instincts, imperative lights and movements, inherent self-effectivities of will, which disguise themselves in a mental form. So all these tendencies, and we will look at each of them, because they are disguised in mental form, because they take on the substance of mind in their working and operate in the way the normal logical mental processes would occur. Therefore, we do not recognize that they are essentially higher impulses than purely mental. But, Sri Aurobindo says, but the visible principle of supermind can only emerge when the necessary mental conditions are prepared, which will permit it to organize itself in man, the mental living creature. So in exactly the same pattern of the earlier stages, in our mind, when these processes get more organized, the same impulses which we have just read, when they get more explicit, more organized, and are able to support each other mutually, to separate eventually from the inferior processes of logical intelligence, and can stand on their own without needing to be garbed by those logical processes, then we will say, there is an action of supermind through this mental living creature. And so this transition is extremely important, and for that, observing these tendencies in us, supporting them, assisting them to become stronger, clearer, separating them from the logical tendencies with which they are mixed, would be the first conscious efforts that we would make. So let's see what these are. First, sympathies. These are the least easily recognized as mental processes. In the modern exploration of the brain, we find there is an instinct in the brain neuronal level to imitate something we see. So if you see somebody, you're watching their face and they smile, there's a whole batch of neurons in the brain which kick in and start imitating that and cause you to smile. So they say mirror neurons. It's a nice name to give, which seems as if to explain things. But what is it in the neuronal process which recognizes smile as smile, which recognizes it as something worth imitating, which then knows exactly how to manipulate all the combinations of muscles around the mouth to make your smile appear similar and to release the necessary endorphins and other chemicals to make you feel good in your heart? Nothing is explained. You've just put a label, a sticker, which now suddenly seems as if to show that you know more than you actually know. The mirror neurons are not explained at all. In fact, the mirror neurons even are said to capture expressions of intention or thought, which would be a very nice, convenient basis for explaining telepathy. But at the end of the day, nothing is explained. We are just told these neurons automatically catch and imitate. But there is something else, which is not a neuronal, which is the nature of the mind consciousness. We experience spontaneously an affinity with other minds. We experience through that affinity and even an identification. Through that affinity, we receive what is happening in another mind, or we transmit what is happening in our mind into other minds. There is a kind of a free, direct interchange of states of mind, intentions of mind, and even patterns of thought and emotion taking place in other minds. This is the first indication of the principle of supermind working inside the human mind. Consider now a dog. The dog, I was watching this just two weeks ago. Suddenly this dog gets up, starts barking, goes to the window and looks out, goes to another window and looks out and waits. And then after a few minutes, I hear a vehicle outside. After a while, the dog goes to the door, barks and waits. And then within a minute, the door opens and the master of the house comes in. Now, long before we knew even that he was coming down the road, the dog knew it and was preparing for it and knew exactly where he was at each step. The interesting experiments of this kind where they leave a camera in the house watching the dog. The master of the house is at work, and when he finishes his work, his mind turns to going home. Instantly, through the camera, we see the dog gets up and starts getting restless, looking at the door, moving around as if expecting. The telepathic link is so deep, so conscious in the dog. We would say even the principle of sympathy is stronger when the intellect is not interfering. Because of the activity of our formed intelligence, this direct access, this direct connection which is possible and which is native to the deeper principle behind mind, that is covered up. And so naturally, in the training for developing and awakening these faculties of supermind, one of the first requirements would be to train the intellectual tendency and activity of the mind to become quiet. As long as that is hyperactive, these finer movements of the supermind cannot be explicitly known, felt, supported, or intensified, or even separated from the activity of intelligence. Now, because of this tendency of sympathy, when I sense, now unaware to my conscious awareness, I sense through that sympathy something, immediately that sensation rushes, modifies my logical thinking process, and takes on the form of a logical explanation for why I sensed it. Are you not well? I tell somebody. You look pale. Now, if you observe the actual process, you sensed the person was not well. And as you start speaking, are you not well? Your intelligence is rushing now to justify, and it says you look pale, you look out of sorts. But notice the vocabulary we use. You look out of sorts, means there's something not okay, but I cannot place my mind on what it is. I cannot tell you exactly what it is. Out of sorts is a vague description which you cannot define, which you cannot reduce to specifics. Somehow you don't seem yourself, your normal self. Why? And you can't break it down. Because you sensed it at a different level. Your logic covered up with the stuff of mind, gave it a mental form to justify that it was an emergence of a logical and observed process. So sympathies. And if you continue the process of sympathy, unity. You experience even an identity. And this happens at a level which is so subtle that we don't even realize how important it is. When somebody is narrating to you an incident or an experience, observe what happens inside you. First, there's a description, perhaps a material description, and your mind tunes in by sympathy, enters into a kind of a connection with the other person's thoughts and feelings. And then the person is trying to convey something for which he does not have clear words. And at that point you concentrate until in a brief moment you identify with what he is trying to express. And in that identification you know what he is trying to say, and you say, okay, I got it. And if you have a better vocabulary, you come up with the right words, and he says, yes, that's exactly what I wanted to say. But how did you get to know exactly what he intended? The only way this can happen is when some part of you identifies and experiences exactly what he is trying to express. So the unity that takes place, even momentarily in consciousness, is the vehicle by which we actually communicate knowledge or experience at the most essential level. All the rest, the words and descriptions, are only a vehicle to help the attunement and make possible at a deeper subliminal level the point of contact of identity. And now if you could quiet your mind and deliberately, consciously lean your consciousness, lean into the other person or the situation and make that contact directly, you would receive that same precise knowledge without the mixed form and clutter of the processes of the mind. In fact, this also happens when we are reading a book, for example, especially when you're reading Sri Aurobindo and there is a sentence which is very complex. I don't get it. So I become quiet. Maybe I set aside the book. I have a conversation, or I sit in silence, or I meditate. Next time I pick up the book and read the same sentence, oh, it's obvious, this is what he was saying. Why didn't I understand it the first time? Something inside me turned attention to know, while my mind was quiet or busy, distracted somewhere else. It continued that process until it touched the knowledge experientially in identity and had it ready now. Next, when my mind started the activity of reading and trying to understand, pop, this emerged. And now it's obvious. So the process, this principle of unity is at the root of all communication or transmission of knowledge or experience. So sympathies, then unities, are the stuff of supermind. And next, we will look at the other 5, which we will keep for next Sunday. But you get a sense here already of how these things are operating behind and through the current mental processes. And when those things become more and more direct, more and more strong compared to the mental process which become less active, then you will have a gradual transition and emergence of a more organized action of the supermind emerging from our mind. So we will continue this passage next time, and you can see how the principle itself of what we have described as supermind exists even at lower levels of life and even at still lower levels of matter. It is the supermind principle in matter which makes for what we call universal laws of matter. All electrons behave the same way under the same circumstances, wherever they may be in the universe and whatever time. Why? Because there is a universal knowledge-will response acting through all electron forms. And that universal knowledge-will is supermind. Now subliminal behind 2 layers. But it is that which is making possible this consistent expression which we articulate as law of physics. So all the way down from the most material through life, through mind, it is secretly supermind which is working, and through mind when it emerges, it comes into its own for the first time in evolution. And then it can turn upon the other layers and make itself explicit in all their workings. Make itself the first principle of their working and their existing workings secondary principles. This would be what we call the transformation of mind, life and matter. When supermind can freely mold mind, freely mold life, freely mold material forms as it wills directly by its complete knowledge will. It's a fascinating passage, and we can meditate on these 2 ideas which we have especially seen, but all the rest for a few minutes.